Good day. You're watching Edu Bulletin. I am Hamiza.
And I'm Noor Azalia.
The headlines. Today we are discussing comparative education and its definition. We are placing an Asian country and a non-Asian country under a microscope and objectively comparing their education system. Today's discussion will focus on Malaysia's education system as opposed to Finland's education system. It will highlight their education historical background, governmental roles in their education, types of schools, and their respective issues. Finally, our guest will address the silver lining and future plans in both countries. Before moving forward to our special news segment, comparative education is the basis of our discussion today. It is essentially an academic field of study that examines education in one country, or rather a group of countries, by using data and insights drawn from practices and situations in other countries. However, it has different definitions from many different authors throughout the century, but what is common in these definitions is the emphasis on the use of data from another educational system. Why do different authors define it differently? The concept of comparative education is broad, and its definition is growing and changing. Among these authors, or as we call them comparativists, they hold different takes depending on the purpose of pursuing the study of comparative education. It's important to note that the field of comparative education is an intersection of the social sciences, education, and cross-national study which leads to many different definitions. For example, in 1996, Francis Gatao, a Kenyan educator and author, defined it as the study of educational systems in which one seeks to understand the similarities and differences among educational systems. Meanwhile, going back to 1957, Isaac Kendall, known as the father of comparative education, emphasized on not only the similarities and differences, but the cause behind educational problems of different countries. Isaac Kendall's work was highly influenced by Sir Michael Sadleir, who was a historian and an educationalist. In 1900, he introduced a new method of conceptualizing comparative education and highlighted that the education system is the outcome of societal or contextual forces which have operated for a long time. This means that as we compare and contrast, understanding the people and their society is important, and Isaac Kendall expanded on that idea, which was followed by other authors. Therefore, the factors that influence the educational development in each country will center around their people and their values. According to Nicholas Hans, who wrote a book on comparative education in 1958, he classified three groups of factors influencing the educational development, which are the natural factors such as race, environment, and language, religious factors, and secular factors such as humanism, socialism, and nationalism. These factors essentially shape the education system. So why the need for comparative education? According to Harold Noah and Max Eckstein, comparative education has four purposes. It is used to describe educational systems, processes, or outcomes, and assist in the development of educational institutions and practices. It is also used to highlight the relationships between education and society and establish generalized statements about education that are valid in more than one country. It is apparent that comparative education is more than merely just looking at the similarities and differences. For example, PISA, Program for International Student Assessment, is a test intended for school leaders from across the world to assess 15-year-olds' critical thinking and application of skills and knowledge in real-world context. The objective of PISA is to improve educational policy and quality in countries participating in this assessment. Thus, the data and information gathered from comparative studies and analysis can be used to improve the education system and bring change for a better future. Before getting further into the discussion, let's talk about the historical background of each country. In Malaysia, the education's history can be divided into four timeframes: pre-British period, pre-World War II, pre-independence, and post-independence. In the pre-British period, the education focused on religious teaching, and it included survival skills such as agriculture, fishing, and hunting. Sekolah Pondok, madrasah, and other Islamic schools were the earliest forms of schooling. In the pre-World War II period, the education administrations in the Malay Peninsula were based on the colonial policy called the divide and rule policy. So schools were divided into four mediums according to language: Malay medium schools, Chinese medium schools, Tamil medium schools, and English medium schools. Meanwhile, in the pre-independence period, the Japanese military abolished Chinese and English schools and replaced it with Japanese schools. Government, Tamil, and Malay schools were ordered to add Japanese orientation into the curriculum. Lastly, in the post-independence period, the national education policy was established and a comprehensive system of education was developed and various departments were integrated, eventually leading us to the Malaysian education blueprint that we know of today. On the other hand, up until the 18th century, the church was responsible for the education in Finland. Much like the early days of education in Malaysia, religion was an integral part of schools at that time, and it mainly focused on basic reading ability that were taught in traveling schools. In the 19th century, Finland education evolved into a secondary school network, gymnasium, which is a 3-year school to prepare for academic studies, and the university. During this time, philosophers also advocated for a primary school system, and it was only established in 1866. As a result, Finland had primary school, secondary school, the gymnasium, and the university. In the mid-19th century, Finnish became an official language, replacing Swedish, and everyone was given a right to attend school, although it was competitive and heavily affected by status. In the post-World War II period, there were demands for a better education system regardless of socioeconomic background. The parliament introduced legislation to reform the education system in 1968 to replace the two-tier system of grammar schools and civic schools with free comprehensive schools for children aged 7 to 16. It was initially centrally controlled, but eventually the authority was transferred to local municipalities and teachers. This reform has yielded great results for Finland's education system. Now that we have laid out a brief historical background, let's get into the modern-day education system in detail.
Let's briefly go through the government's role in the Malaysian education system. Education in Malaysia is overseen by the Ministry of Education. Under the wings of the MOE, the policy and educational development sector plays a major role in orchestrating the shape and flow of the education system. All of the national educational policies are planned and formed by the policy and educational development sector, who also implements strategic planning for educational development based on government policies and the Education Act. They also formulate and develop the national education curriculum and the never-ending controversial policies of assessment and measurement in education based on the National Philosophy of Education, or the NEP. According to Lee 2007, who researched on centralized decentralization in Malaysian education, Malaysian educational administration is highly centralized. What is meant by centralized is that the administration is heavily controlled by a single authority, and in the case of our country, the MOE. Vital and major decision and policy making takes place at the federal level. However, the ultimate authority in education is the parliament, in which policy issues that have wider consequences are referred to the cabinet before final decision making is made. The question is, why is the Malaysian education system very centralized? Well, the current formal education system is based on the British schooling system, as they had occupied the Malayan for a hefty amount of time. According to Wahid, Hamid, Low, and Ashari 2011, England has one of the most centralized and class-divided education systems in Europe, hence why the Malaysian students need to undergo various types of examinations during their years in the Malaysian school, despite our declared freedom from the British colonization. The case of funding should be highly considered when it comes to education. Malaysian government funds public schools as well as public higher educational institutions, which consist of public universities, polytechnics, and community colleges. Education in Malaysia is definitely not free, but the federal government of Malaysia, through the Ministry of Education and Ministry of Higher Education, contributed about 98% of the total financing, according to Marzuki 2008. While studying in most countries will require handing over an often hefty tuition fee, Finland has somehow managed to keep university education entirely state funded, even for international students. How is this possible? According to Aho, Pitkanen, and Salberg, who studied the education of Finland, Finland has long employed the tripartite concept in politics, which involves cooperation between the government, trade unions, and employers' organizations. The key stakeholders were the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Finance, the Teachers' Union, and the teachers themselves. While we have the MOE in Malaysia, Finland has the Ministry of Education and Culture. The ministry participates in the work of the government by planning, outlining, and implementing its policies. It also prepares acts, decrees, and decisions, and it is also responsible for the preparation of matters related to the use of budget funds. The Ministry of Education and Culture does not only cover education and cultural matters, but also daycare, education, training and research, arts, culture, sports and youth policies, public library systems, and the student financial aid. Over the past 40 years, Finland has shifted from a highly centralized system, which emphasized external testing such as standardized exams, to a more localized system in which highly trained teachers themselves design curriculum around the very lean national standards. Finland's government made education reform its primary goal and set out to mold both primary and lower secondary education into a comprehensive basic school for all children. Furthermore, many believe that improving the quality of education would advance social justice and stimulate economic development. We are absolutely lucky to have two experienced teachers with us today to share some thoughts and knowledge on the education system in Malaysia and Finland. We have Ms. Haizer Natasha, an excellent teacher from Malaysia, and Ms. Aina Balkis, an experienced teacher teaching in Finland. Let's hear from them. Ms. Haizerin, now that we have talked about the role of the government in both countries, what are the impacts of the government's role to the Malaysian education system?
Thank you so much, Ms. Azalia, and thank you for having me here. The government may have impacted the secondary school system in a few ways, mainly in terms of fundings, teacher selection, as well as the dilemma of centralization or decentralization of assessments. Now, let me first talk about fundings. The government of Malaysia has allocated an enormous amount of money for the education sector during the last few decades to ensure the highest quality of education for Malaysian society. In the current era of challenging economic conditions, the issue of education financing will remain important, and the management of education finance will always be at a great concern for any government. Throughout the years of establishing the so-called National Financial Blueprint 2011 until 2020, which seeks to build a comprehensive and holistic approach towards consumer protection and education. So we still have a long way to go. A study was carried out in Malaysia to identify the adequacy of financial allocation for low-performing schools in Selangor. High-performing schools in Malaysia are often provided additional funding, while low-performing schools are given just the basic allocation based on the number of students. Now, most students or children in low-performing schools are from lower socioeconomic status. Thus, parent-teacher associations are not able to provide additional support for these schools. I believe that all students or children, regardless of their social class, should be given equality in the opportunity to obtain good quality education. And in fact, countless research reveals that most schools in rural areas are faced with inadequacy of funding. These schools mostly have fewer students, and since allocation is based on a number of students, these schools end up getting less and less funds. Additionally, the allocations given to these schools have not changed for a long period of time. Rising costs and prices need to be accounted for. The impact of centralized education is that state funding is tied to academic performance. Schools become motivated to push their better students to perform excellently or become better, and then assigning better teachers for better students only, and treat the weaker students as potentially harmful outliers to their overall performance instead of actively working on improving how these students learn. Now, and then we have government's impact in terms of teacher selection or job security. The Education Ministry's special one-off initiative to recruit over 18,000 teachers to address the shortage of educators in 4 states is a good move on the government's part. However, I think that every care should be taken into consideration to ensure that only the best is absorbed or selected, as the teaching profession is going through a challenging time due to the pandemic and needs more capable people who can shoulder the burden. Now, to think of it, if the government is only selecting just about anyone who wants the job, they may not be able to handle the responsibilities well, and no doubt become an additional burden to the education system. This is because people today choose teaching profession not really because it's their passion, but because it's a safe career option. Some still do it for passion, but the majority don't. So this is more evident in the lower tier schools. Hence, I personally think that the education policy makers should be composed of actual teachers with significant experience of the grind at grassroots levels. They should be grouped and specialized to encompass urban, semi-urban, and rural schools so that all issues are covered. And then lastly, we have the government's impact in terms of centralized and decentralized assessments. The rapid changes of the face of the government reflects the political instability of Malaysia. Political interference affects the educational policies as well as the regulations, because they had to be consistently revised and altered. Now that's the problem. The school curriculum imposed by the central government on all government-aided schools being set at a low academic level, resulting in an upward trend in the number of students receiving perfect scores in the annual national examinations, like SPM. And another issue is the state-set curriculum requiring many courses that cater to political demands, meaning there is simply not enough time and resources to teach mathematics, reading, and science well. So for example, students in some schools are required to learn 3 languages, and then we have some students who need to receive religious instruction and study many courses on Malaysian history and society. The education system underwent numerous systemic reforms in the 60 plus years of Barisan Nasional rule. Every reform was a contentious affair, and every reform failed to improve the performance of the average student. Now, what usually went up after each systemic reform was the quantity of students in the education system, but never the quality of the education itself.
Right. So, Ms. Ainabi, what about the impact of the government's role in Finland?
First of all, thank you for having me here. So regarding our question, so the impact of the government's role in Finland. So government plays a huge role in administering the education system here in Finland. From what was discussed earlier, their roles on fundings, equalizing and decentralizing education, and lastly, teacher selection and job security, has resulted in a very positive impact towards the education system. So let's go through it one by one. Under funding, we have worked systematically over 35 years to make sure that competent professionals can craft the best learning condition for all students in all schools. So equity and opportunity to learn is supported in many ways in addition to basic funding. So Finnish schools are generally small, fewer than 300 students usually, with relatively small class size, and are uniformly well equipped. So the notion of caring for students educationally and personally is a central principle in the schools. So all students receive free meals daily, as well as free healthcare, transportation, learning materials, and counseling in their schools, so that the foundation for learning are in place. So because of our funding is primarily from the public and the government, it stops other sectors from making profit of the education system, really sets the education and business apart, which protects our values for providing free education. With steady funding, families are more encouraged to send their kids to school without any financial pressure or burden. Next is equalizing and decentralizing education. So beginning in the 1970s, Finland launched reforms to equalize educational opportunity by first eliminating the practice of separating students into very different tracks based on their test scores, and then by eliminating the examination themselves. So there are no external standardized tests used to rank students or schools in Finland, and most teacher feedback to students is in narrative form, so they're emphasizing on description of their learning process and areas for growth. So however, over the years, Finland faces challenges, and this can be seen between the year 2006 and the year 2012, where Finland's PISA scores in science, reading, and math fell. So they pointed out to the system lack of centralized accountability and features like late start times, lack of homework, absence of test assignments. So these are the challenges that we face. So another part is on teacher selection. So aside from taking care of our students and reforming syllabus and assessments, teachers' job position is also taken into consideration. So by the late 1970s, investment in teachers was an additional focus. So teachers' education was improved and extended. So policymakers decided that if they invested in a very skillful teachers, they could allow local schools more autonomy to make decisions about what and how to teach, a reaction against the oppressive centralized system they sought to overhaul. So prospective teachers are competitively selected from the pool of college students. Only around 15% of those who apply are admitted and receive a 3-year graduate level teacher preparation program, entirely free of charge and with a living stipend. So Finland made the decision to invest in a uniformly well-prepared teaching force by recruiting top candidates and paying them to go to school. So slots in teachers training program are highly coveted and shortages are virtually unheard of. So according to the Teaching and Learning International Survey, job satisfaction is defined as the sense of fulfillment and gratification that teachers get from their work. So job satisfaction has a positive association with teachers' attitude towards their work and with their performance. So in Finland, 88% of teachers report that all in all, they are satisfied with their job, and 72% of teachers are satisfied with the terms of their teaching contract. I personally believe that employing teachers who are satisfied with their job and their earnings can leave positive impacts in the education system.
The Malaysian education platforms, just like the country's cultural and ethnic landscape, are diverse and numerous. They include the first one, we have government or public schools. In Malaysia, there are over 10,000 government schools, including primary and secondary schools. These schools are funded by the government. Parents are only required to pay for miscellaneous expenses such as exercise books, stationery, and school uniform. The school's curriculum emphasizes the national language of Bahasa Malaysia, and other subjects, except languages, are taught in Bahasa Malaysia. And then, secondly, we have the vernacular schools. The vernacular schools were created specifically for specific ethnic and cultural communities in Malaysia, which are the Chinese and Indians. Hence, Mandarin is the primary medium of instruction for SJKC and Tamil for SJKT. The schooling system was introduced to promote the languages and cultural values of these communities. Over the past 3 decades, the vernacular schools, especially the Chinese schools, have further developed, and it is now common to see children from other ethnic communities going to school in such environments. Despite vernacular schools using either Mandarin or Tamil as a medium of instruction, Bahasa Malaysia and English language are taught as compulsory subjects. Next, we have the international schools. These schools offer international education in an international setting. They are fully independent as they are not government controlled. However, the benefits of studying in an international school far outweigh that of private schools, as it offers global acceptance, which means easier entry to foreign universities for higher education. Access to the best international schools in Malaysia is now available for both Malaysian and international students. And then we have the private schools. Private school system has existed in Malaysia for close to 40 years. It began as an effort by the education providers to expand and enhance learning opportunities for Malaysian families who can afford to send their children to private schools. The private schools also follow the Malaysian national curriculum and the IGCSE syllabus in some cases. Although private schools follow the Malaysian national curriculum, what differentiates these schools from government schools are the more extensive physical infrastructure and facilities which enable greater access to technology, which offered additional language classes as well as a whole range of other academic and non-academic activities that widen and enhance their educational experience. The final type of school available in Malaysia is homeschooling. Homeschooling is a relatively new concept in Malaysia, but it is legal. Although the Education Amendment Act 2002 has made it mandatory for parents to enroll the children in a primary school for 6 years, the Ministry of Education has the discretion to exempt any student from this compulsory education. Unfortunately, stringent regulations have developed which often prevent families from obtaining official approval. Parents can apply for exemption if their children is exceptionally gifted or physically disabled, or if the available schools are not able to meet this need, or if the family members travel abroad frequently. Parents, however, must ensure that the homeschooled children follow the national syllabus. Now that we are enlightened on the various types of schooling in Malaysia, Ms. Haizrin, what are the impacts of having multiple types of schools?
Right, thank you so much, Ms. Azalia. Now that you've mentioned that Malaysia has multiple types of schools, I am reminded how our country is very unique in the sense that many types of schools are allowed to coexist. There are national schools, Chinese schools, Tamil schools, and religious schools, besides private and international schools. Corresponding to the impacts of having many types of schools in a country, I note with great interest the recent revival of the debate about a single stream school system. Vernacular education, which includes the various religious schools, has long been a subject of debate in the multiracial country, and it has flared up in Malaysian politics every now and then, often as part of racial posturing by Malay nationalists. Advocates of single-stream education urged the government to only establish a single multiracial school instead of having more than one type of schools in Malaysia. Those who support this system believe that all children or students should integrate under one system so that they are exposed to different ethnic groups from an early age. They believe that the fact that when we have such a diverse education system, it shows that people have grown up segregated by race, religion, and social class. Hence why they supported having single-stream school, as it could be the remedy to reunite all races and the entire Malaysia. Now, you may or may not know that up to this day, Chinese schools are open and accepting of all races and are deemed to be more multiracial compared to national schools without any discrimination or racism. In fact, MEB, or Malaysia Education's Blueprint, revealed that there are Chinese schools with very significant numbers of non-Chinese enrollment. To give you an example, SJKC in Klang has about 45% of non-Chinese students. Don't you think that's enough to reunite Malaysians outside of national schools? And on the other hand, there are still groups that insist the vernacular system should prevail or be accepted by the nation. Vernacular schools have always been part of the national education landscape, but back in the days, many parents still sent their children to Sekolah Kebangsaan or national schools because it was considered as the better choice. Now, almost half of the Bumiputra community doesn't support national schools. Why so? Why do you think that happened? Could it possibly be because they believe that the education quality in national schools is not up to standard anymore? Think about it. Researchers from the National University of Malaya found that support for vernacular schools from the Chinese community stemmed from the fear of losing their cultural identity and use of mother tongue in national schools. Additionally, there is also the perception that Chinese schools offer a higher quality education than their national counterparts. So, this difference in thinking has affected the nation's efforts to develop an unified educational system for all citizens in order to create national unity. To address this, the government should first draft a conclusive education plan focusing on a top-down approach to promote greater appreciation of different cultures. And if an alternative were to be considered to encourage more cross-cultural engagement, maybe we could start by revising the curriculum in national schools instead of completely abolishing vernacular schools, which leads to forced unification. We don't need voluminous blueprints to tell us how best to strengthen national schools to attract other races to attend national schools. The best way is to take a look at the push factors and address what has changed in the last decades or two. The quality of education, a predominantly monoethnic teaching fraternity, or could it be a declining focus on English? At the end of the day, it's up to the government who has the power to improve education at national schools so that national schools could be the school of choice again.
I absolutely agree, Ms. Heisrin. Especially coming from a multicultural country, this is something that cannot be swept under the rug. Now, moving on to the types of schools in Finland. Every child in Finland is assigned a place in a nearby school because there is no urge for parents to find a good school. As many teachers in Finland claim, all the schools are essentially the same. Both private and public schools receive the same level of public funding and under public supervision. It was also made clear that private school funding is prohibited. If we were to point out the differences, private schools in Finland follow the national core curricula and the qualification requirements are confirmed by the Finnish National Agency for Education. The private education provider must fulfill requirements set out in legislation in order to be licensed. Meanwhile, public schools are run by government agencies from national officials to local authorities who are drawn from the same pool of university-trained educators. The local authorities and government co-finance basic education, and local authorities or joint municipal boards maintain most institutions providing basic and upper secondary level education. As a result, the majority of compulsory education provided in Finland is through public schools and only a tiny percent of it is through private schools. So how does this impact the children and the people in Finland, Ms. Ainabi?
So Finland's decision to give free education and its prohibition of private funding is able to abolish financial disparities among the types of school. So in most countries, they have the situation that private schools are better and it is justifiable based on what they charge. This will create gaps in the society and send a message to students who may not be able to afford private school believe that they are receiving second-class education. So prohibition of private funding stops this from happening as it closes competition between schools. Parents are not looking for the best schools to enroll their kids in, as every school is given the same funding and attention. Therefore, every school is the perfect choice for their children. So it promotes equal chance and quality education for all the students. So with these actions taken by the government, we can provide equal educational opportunities to all students, irrespective of place of residence or social background. So this directly impacts Finland's social mobility. So the forefront question to ponder on is, what if we can make upward mobility happen? If instead of spending money to make life more tolerable for the poor, governments invested in transforming children of poverty into productive, non-dependent, tax-contributing people. So it's time to look at social mobility, not as something that just happens, but as something that we can create. Yeah, bottom line is that in Finland, there is no debate between the types of schools that are available here, as this nation's main goal is to provide equality from the very beginning.
All right, we have heard from the teachers about the government's role impact on education, as well as the effect of different types of schools. I am positive that the audience are considering a lot of issues and matters that were mentioned by the teachers. Fret not, there's a platform we've prepared for you where you can give your opinions or voice your grouses about the issues we are bringing forward. But before that, we'll go back to Hamiza.
Thank you, Azalia. There are definitely both positive and negative aspects mentioned in the discussion today. We did not only focus on the good, we also focused on the bad. Despite the issues, I believe that there is always a silver lining. So, our beloved guests, what are your final thoughts for today?
Personally, I'd say that the education system here has its ups and downs. Malaysia is definitely not becoming a backward country. Instead, its growth is simply moving at a slower rate compared to its peers, especially like Vietnam, Indonesia, and Singapore. And as we know, the quality of education is what it takes for a country to achieve one of the sustainable development goals. Malaysia has come a long way ahead as far as the education system is concerned. The opening of several international schools over the past few decades has increased competitions among the government-run educational institutions, domestic private institutes, and the international schools. This has enhanced the quality of education in leaps and bounds of the Southeast Asian country and has helped the students. Though we kept seeing the downside of the system, right? Which is that it fails mainly due to the inconsistent policy which resulted in poor execution. When you link politics with education, all you get are different policies when different ministers manage the Ministry of Education, MOE. So each time the students are like lab rats with all those trials and errors. Hence, I think our education system consistently face a crisis because there is no more fun in learning, and those who are teaching are not passionate about teaching, but they are in the profession. Nevertheless, there's always hope and room for improvement in this system.
To nicely wrap this discussion, although I have shared how progressive Finland is in their education reform and curricula, we simply can't dismiss other challenges that our system faces. So debates circulating on whether or not other countries should adopt Finland's system should not only be suggested at face value. Reason being, the point isn't to argue that Finland's education system isn't valuable. Rather, it's that educational tourists look to Finland, see what they want to see, and don't bother to ask the questions Finland itself continues to grapple with. So, insights should harmonize with an understanding of Finland's culture, its history, and a wider range of evidence, not simply be a laundry list of fashionable factoids. In the case of Finland's educational system, people have been somehow misled by stories made by persons who have only seen Finland to their narrow lens. Yes, sadly. Through the words of Tim Oates, the real story of Finland is more subtle, more challenging, and far, far more interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our wonderful teacher guests. We have Miss Haizri Natasha and Miss Aina Balkis for willing to share your thoughts and notions on our topic. We highly appreciate your contributions and support.
That's all we have for you today. To our viewers, head over to the link provided to participate in the Mentimeter and share your opinions on the issues brought up today. Thank you for watching EduBulletin. The future begins here. Goodbye.